Good morning, everyone. We're very excited that you're here, and we really appreciate your time. We know you have very busy schedules, and your input into the regional action plan is really important to make this a successful endeavor for ourselves, for your local government, and we appreciate all of your participation as a coalition member and as a stakeholder or a new colleague or as a partner. So thank you. Thank you. So this morning, I'll be facilitating this session with help from Kara, and also we have Simone, who is our colleague from the National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program. She's a new Science and Policy Fellow here at the Regional Planning Council. Kara is our Comprehensive Resiliency Planner. She facilitated the first chapter workshop and is really a co-lead in the development of this regional action plan for us. So we appreciate your time. So I'm going to get started on just a quick review on the agenda, and it's accurate, not like the one that I actually sent out, which had a typo in it. So what we're going to do this morning is we're actually going to go through and we'll do a quick round robin of introductions in a minute. But first, just a quick review of the agenda. So Kara's going to give us an update on Chapter 1 workshop. I'm going to provide a brief overview of some of the relevant regional activities that apply to this. This meeting is really designed to focus on bringing a common understanding of knowledge regarding aspects of different community populations, health, climate impacts, and then housing risks. So it's a very important workshop. They're all important, but this perhaps is new to our region. So we'll cover this. We will take a break at 10:30, just a 15-minute break. And then when we come back, we'll go through the housing and housing risks, and that'll go on for a half an hour. Then we'll do a little bit of a recap and a breakout and some preparation for getting ready to use different technologies. We hope to introduce you to a new thing, or maybe you've already used it, called Jamboard. We'll do a little visioning exercise, but then we're going to put you right into a breakout group that you'll be in for 45 minutes, where you will actually work on goals and objectives and relating to topic areas that you signed up for before. And I'll talk a minute about it. So we're not inhumane. So we know you're going to need to eat at some time. So we've scheduled time in for lunch for you. So we'll all, go take a break for that. And then we'll come back and go back into your breakout groups again for a half an hour to work on actions and report cards or success measurements. So, and then come back and do some report outs for that. We'll be consistently in a Google spreadsheet over time, and then we'll do a wrap up. So we hope that you can stay with us for a good chunk of this. This is actually like as if we were trying to in a real working environment. So now I'm going to switch to the next screen, which is, here we go. So, what I want to do is go around and have everybody do a really, really quick set of introductions. And then we're going to post into the chat a sign up, a link to the Google form so you can go and re-sign up. So the complexity of Zoom makes it difficult for us to export the actual specific groups that you signed up for. So we're going to enable you to go re-sign up for either housing or health in that regard. So if we can, I think it's really important that we at least do a brief sort of meet and greet of everyone who's here. And I'm going to, since it's kind of a challenging thing to like just know if you're on deck or not, I'm going to use our the skills that we've been learning from our fantastic NREL project leads, and I'll actually go around and call on you. And I'll give you a first up and second up and that sort of thing. So Mr. Gregory, please introduce yourself.
First, could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Ron Gregory. I'm a vice president with AECOM, a environmental planning infrastructure organization. I'm based out of the Tampa office at Rocky Point, and I've been engaged in the resiliency issues, particularly in Tampa Bay, for the last couple of years. And my interest is in any impacts on infrastructure.
Okay. Great, thank you. So Daphne, I'm going to call on you next, and then Sergio after Daphne.
You guys see me? I think it's kind of
Yes.
bright, dark right now, but good morning, everyone. My name's Daphne Green. I'm the Health and All Policies Planner for the City of Pinellas Park.
Thank you. And we got a clue by that fact that you're in health. So Sergio.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Sergio Alvarez. I am an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida. I am an economist by training, but I also work in tourism and now in this area of resilience. And I guess my interest today is looking at the different dimensions of the climate challenge for the state of Florida.
Okay, great. So when I do this, because we have 30 folks here, we want to be able to go fast. So name, title, organization, and a very short interest of like today's topics or not. So Andrea, I'll call on you next, and then Dr. Robinson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Galinsky. I am an assistant scholar in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Florida. I am also a research affiliate of the UF Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. And my interest is really the nexus of housing and pre-disaster and post-disaster recovery planning.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you, CJ. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Robinson. I'm an anatomist and an emergency doc. I'm a member of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, which is an affiliate of the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. I'm also a member of the Sustainability Committee of the City of Tarpon Springs.
Oh, welcome, welcome. I'll go Ramona, and then Sheridan, and then Alyssa.
Thank you, CJ. Good morning. My name is Ramona Madhu Singh Hector. I'm a regional specialized agent for urban sustainability with the University of Florida Extension Service. I'm in the Southwest District of Florida, which includes north to Pasco and all the way south to Collier County. And my interest is in community vulnerability and the intersections and relationships with community resource development. Thank you.
Fantastic. Good morning,
Sheridan Boyle, Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Clearwater. Yeah, all of it. All of it's an interest, community vulnerability.
Thanks, Sheridan. Alyssa.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Plancher. I'm a technical advisor with the Florida Housing Coalition, and I'm also part of the REACH team. And so on my end, I am all things affordable housing, homelessness, housing equity, and so on. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. So I'll do Melissa, then Ariana, and then Caitlin.
Hey everyone, I'm Melissa Baldwin. I'm the Director of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, and I'm based in Riverview, and I'm most interested in the co-benefits of improving housing stock to make our homes more efficient and resilient.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Ariane Corbett, and I work with No Kid Hungry. I'm based out of the Tampa Bay area, but my region goes Tampa Bay down all the way down through South Florida. And my interest is on the impact of food insecurity on communities, and especially with kids.
Fantastic, thank you. Caitlin.
Hi, Caitlin Murphy. I am the Daphne for Pinellas County, so I coordinate the county's Health and All Policies initiative. So focused on all things public health and local government related.
Fantastic. Rachel. Oh, Rachel will come back there.
I had to find the unmute button. Sorry about that. Hi, all. This is Rachel Rohde. I am an analyst with our Coastal Projects and Program division at Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm interested in looking at resilient adaptation strategies for vulnerable communities.
Okay. So I'm going to call on Sharon Joy and then Smita.
Hello, Sharon Joy Kleitch here in St. Petersburg, and very interested on this topic of our vulnerable communities in relationship to the COVID virus today. I'll be listening for health.
Okay, very good. Smita.
Good morning, everyone. This is Smita. I work as a principal planner with Pinellas County. I work on the local mitigation strategy, and everything that we're going to discuss today is of interest to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Tisha. Please introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Bill, and then Christine.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Tisha Holmes. I am an assistant professor at Florida State University. And I'm very interested in climate change adaptation in Florida and the Caribbean from a planning perspective, as well as a public health perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you. Bill O'Dell.
Hello, Dale. I'm the director of the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies at the University of Florida. And among other things, we manage the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse.
Many things over there. Christina.
My name is Christina Hammer. I'm the CRS coordinator for Hillsborough County, and I'm interested in how to make, mainly neighborhoods stronger against hazards and all this other stuff that people mention.
Great. Well, thank you for bringing up neighborhoods. It is very, very important. Let's see, Tom Schofield, if you would introduce yourself.
Tom Schofield with Pinellas County Planning, interested in community and housing resiliency from the historic preservation perspective.
Thank you. Doug.
On how mute works by now. Hey everybody, I'm Doug Griesnar with United Way Suncoast. I'm here to talk to you all a little bit about our ALICE data and share some information about housing and the state of our community.
Fantastic. So I'm going to do Whitney, then Hank, then Taryn. So please, everybody unmute yourself and be ready to roll.
Hi, everyone. I'm Whitney Blair. I'm a sustainability coordinator for the city of St. Petersburg. And I am very interested in resilient communities and equity.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Hank Hoddy. I'm the Sustainability and Resiliency Coordinator for Pinellas County. Interested in everything under the sun, but today I'll be wearing primarily my resilient housing hats.
I want a hat like that. Awesome. Okay, Taryn, and then Mary Helen, and then Gabriella.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Taryn Sabia. I am a professor with the USF, University of South Florida School of Architecture, and director for the Florida Center for Community Design and Research. I'm very interested in resiliency and equity topics related to community design issues in particular. We worked with Hillsborough County for the community vulnerability study, mitigation and adaptation policies, part of their peril of flood. And we are also part of the REACH team with CJ and crew, and you've heard a few of our other team members introduce themselves already. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with everyone today.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Helen Duke. I'm a senior planner for project management with Pasco Planning and Development Department. I'm very interested in both community and coastal resiliency, as well as food systems and food insecurity.
Great, thank you, Mary Helen. Gabriella, you're mute.
Nope, got it. Good morning, all. My name is Gabriella De Silva. I'm a Florida field consultant for Mom's Clean Air Force. I'm most interested in the public health perspective as far as community resiliency and the adaptation perspective as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we have Alan Biddlecombe, and then I'm going to ask Amanda Moore and Diego. So if you guys could, if you can share your video and unmute yourself, that would be great.
Hey, Alan Biddlecombe here, program administrator with Pasco County Public Infrastructure. I just like hanging out with you guys, so I snuck in here.
I would like the engineers here.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in everything infrastructure.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alan. I'm glad you could join us.
I'm Amanda Moore. I'm the Deputy Director of the Gulf Program for the National Wildlife Federation, based here in St. Pete. And I am interested in coastal resilience and stakeholder engagement as well.
Fantastic. Diego.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diego Guerra. I am a community planner with the Hillsborough Planning Commission.
I am interested in coastal sustainability and coastal resiliency, and I'm here because we are looking at how to incorporate resiliency policies into the four jurisdictional comprehensive plans of Hillsborough County.
Fantastic. So I'm going to look at David Glassner, Ashley Painter, Rob Brown up next. David.
Good morning, David Glassner. I'm the Climate Policy Associate for Audubon, Florida.
Fantastic. Ashley.
Hi, Ashley Painter. I'm a Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Oldsmar and just interested in seeing how community and health work together.
Fantastic. So, let's see. Okay, Cassidy and Rob and Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cassidy Manansky. I'm the Health and All Policies Planner for the City of St. Petersburg, so similar to Daphne and Caitlin earlier.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, Rob Brown with Manatee County, Parks and Natural Resources Environmental Protection. Again, coordinating a lot of activities in Manatee County, but for this effort, most interested in the natural resources and its effects on sustainability for communities.
Fantastic. So Rachel on the iPhone.
Oh, that's just me. Sorry, I called in so I could hear you guys better.
Oh, got it. I was like, oh, another Rachel here. Okay. So who else have I not from Teams? Anybody join us that didn't get to introduce themselves? I would like to actually ask my colleagues, Kara and Simone, to introduce themselves before we move on, because many of you are new to us. So it's great that you're here.
I can go ahead if there's no one else. I'm Kara Sarah with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. My title is a Comprehensive Resiliency Planner. I've been working with the council on some local mitigation strategy updates for Hernando and Citrus counties, and more recently been working on the Regional Resiliency Action Plan stuff.
Great. Simone?
I'm Simone Chapman. I am the Science Policy Fellow at the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. And my role is to integrate community health, racial equity into resilience planning. And I also provide mapping support for the REACH project and the Region Action Plan.
We're super fortunate to have Simone join us this year. So we're learning a lot already, and she's just been a great resource for connecting us to the health and equity components that we're learning more about. So thank you for this introductions. It was great to hear everyone's interest, the focus area that each of you bring with your knowledge and background really can help make these goals and activities really productive. So I just want to encourage you to over the next few minutes while I'm doing some additional backgrounding or before our first break is please go to the Google Sheets that was posted into the chat to sign up and put your email only in the column under the topic of interest. So if it says housing, that's probably most aligned to neighborhoods and some aspect of infrastructure, health, food insecurity, community, welfare, other components like that, potentially more in health. So we're trying to create some cross facilitation. So if you are a housing person and you really care about health, go sign up for health. Or if you're a health person and you really want to advise people who are really focusing on housing pieces, you can go there. There's no restrictions. It's really your interest. We just ask you that you sign up. So Kara can then create the actual breakout groups. I'm going to go to the next one. I just want to acknowledge the funding agencies and organizations that have made this program possible for us. The Environmental Protection Agency, which was a 3-year grant, and a grant from the JP Morgan Chase Foundation which is providing some funding. Their commitment to creating resilient communities in the Tampa Bay region was what excited them to support the regional action plan engagement process. Additionally, recognition of technical support from the NOAA Office for Coastal Management. This is more of the ad hoc and ongoing coastal contacts that I use to say, how should we think about this? How should we do this? They're a wealth of knowledge and expertise, and we're fortunate to have them. So the meeting objectives for today are pretty big picture stuff. And first, we want to make sure that you get an update on what was discussed in chapter 1, which was which Kara will go through, which is some of the aspects of the climate change indicators, stressors, impacts, etc. Then you'll hear from a number of the folks who were just talking, experts, to present information on ALICE and population, specific components of the community's health that are significant, and well, climate and health impacts, and then also in the afternoon on housing. So we're not trying to make everybody an expert. We're just trying to give us a general sense of where we think we're at. One of the goals to come out of this for us is to identify additional resources, frameworks, data. So if you are in here and you're like, oh, this thing was created by X, this is the kind of stuff we want you to post and share also into the chat boxes so that Kara and I can collect this. And then, you know, the big outcome of this is to try to figure out a virtual world of interactivity to break out groups so we can all draft some aspirational visions and goals and objectives for this, which is the chapter of the RRAP, and mostly to learn from each other and to share perspectives, because that's really how we advance ourselves and build capacity within the region, understanding what does equity actually mean? What does you know, a certain level of income actually mean? What are housing and health considerations? So look forward to that with you. So I wanted to, for those of you who are not familiar with us, and for local government colleagues, please bear with me for 2 minutes. I wanted to just give you some background. The Resilience Coalition has a memorandum of understanding that has indicated that a regional action plan should be created with strategies that help us coordinate. And it's really focused on the risks of flooding and projected sea level rise and the additional impacts, as well as identifying, so we're a practical region, identifying funding strategies. How are we going to do this? How are we going to fix what needs to be fixed, or as well as it needs to be based on science. And so this is the point of this chapter, is to understand what are the data sets that we're using. What are the experts that we have? And originally when the MOU was written, and a shout out to Rob Brown, who was on the original technical advisory group, along with others from the Estuary program, and Libby Carnahan from Sea Grant, to develop the MOU, to recognize the need to have a consistent use of sea level rise data, which was developed by the Tampa Bay Climate Science Advisory Panel, to assess the vulnerability and inform that and go forward from there. So that's a brief thing about where is the origin of the regional action plan. It's in the MOU. So the purpose and the scope, as Kara and I have been working on this really since January. There was a lot of conversations at the summit about what should the priorities be in the plan. There was great information in the breakout sessions that came out from, and that the second day had still over 175 people in attendance in these breakout groups. But fundamentally, this should create a positive aspirational vision of what resilient communities can look like, both coastal and inland, urban, suburban, and rural. We have now, with our 6 TBRPC counties, you know, 2 are, you know, have extensive urban areas and suburban areas, and the others are suburban and more rural. So we have to consider climate impacts on all. This should consider state and federal planning requirements. We should be ideally using best practices and leveraging and referring to national metrics or certification programs of leading associations. As a follow-up meeting to the summit, we met with the group of the resilience staff from the counties and key cities to discuss the regional action plan, what it should include. And it was recommended that it include, each chapter include scorecards, which is really a way to measure progress. How will we know if we're succeeding? How will we know if we're making progress? Very straightforward things such as numeric counts of, you know, X people will have done this, or X cities and counties. We also agreed that it should address equity issues throughout the entirety, woven into the goals, not just a separate chapter that says, we'll try to be equitable. The scope of it is to really, address these new existing goals. So there's a lot of work being done by different cities and counties. And so the thing is, what can we learn from each other, create these consistent goals, and to support alignment on critical issues where we can be more effective alone and independently by working together and develop actionable strategies. So one of the tasks that you need to think about today is who is the ultimate audience of the regional action plan, and why we need to create goals that are at a high enough level and with enough public-friendly words that we can support widespread acceptance. This plan is not for us planners and technical experts. It is something for our elected officials, our business leaders, our community leaders to understand so that they can see themselves in this and as a part of this. We want it to include, and it should include, a strong focus on risk reduction, and also, where possible, integrate activities and actions related to mitigation and sustainability. In this particular chapter, we will be focusing on a lot of consistency of data science, policy, and development of coordination components. Kara will talk more about the different goals of the different chapters, but I wanted to give you a top-level summary of that before I turn it over to, and I'll stop sharing, and Kara will now start sharing her screen. And go, she will give us an update on the first workshop, which was last week.
Thanks, CJ. Now I have to find my
I can share, and you can just tell me next if you want.
Okay, it's not giving me the option to share my browser.
That's so crazy. I hate when weird new stuff comes up. So has everyone seen an update on Chapter 1 workshop?
I'm seeing it.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'll move on for you.
Okay. So we had the Chapter 1 workshop last Friday, and sort of the purpose of Chapter 1 is to define climate change terminology and to think about what we should be tracking as far as climate change phenomenon, and what data is needed for the practitioners. So part of that is establishing in Chapter 1 how we will be looking at the impacts to assets such as people, place, and prosperity in the later chapters. And then the first chapter also sets goals and identifies actions for tracking climate change indicators and using data consistently at the local level, and then also communicating the data consistently where that's appropriate. Next slide, please. So this is kind of showing how the impacts will be listed in the chapters 2 through 5. So today we'll be talking about impacts to health, well-being, and housing risks. We'll also have impacts related to engagement, education, and leadership or governance in Chapter 3, which is people. In place, we'll have impacts related to habitats, ecosystems, affordable housing, and critical infrastructure. And finally, in Chapter 5, we'll have impacts to the economy. But that's, again, just to reiterate that the first chapter is really talking about the climate change phenomena, and sort of how do we track climate change as it's happening, and then how it impacts our assets and resources will be listed in the chapters that also set goals and actions related to those impacts. Next slide, please. So one of the things that will be identified in the first chapter is the hazards. So the hazards are what would be being made worse by climate change. So these are the list of hazards, which is a combination of the statewide hazard mitigation plan hazards and some hazards that were listed as important in some of our meetings in September and October. So algal blooms and biological hazards are sort of additional hazards that are unique to our region, in addition to the natural hazards listed in the statewide hazard mitigation plan. Next
So,
slide, please. Oh, go ahead.
Kara, would we consider biological would be pandemic then? Is that also?
It would include pandemic,
Okay.
and it could also, I mean, we can continue to refine what we want to include in that biological hazard if we wanted to. It's kind of just a list, and it allows us to identify things that can be integrated into future local mitigation strategies. So when we're thinking about the later chapters, if we want to key certain hazards for emergency management in the future, we can do that.
Got it. Thanks.
So this is showing, again, the outline of how chapter 1 integrates with the following chapters. So the first chapter will talk about climate indicators and how climate stressors and non-climate stressors worsen the hazards and result in impacts to our assets. So that's chapters 2 through 5. Next slide, please. So this is one of the proposed climate indicators, or a list of the proposed climate indicators for the region. The first being mean sea level, annual average precipitation, annual average air temperature, annual average water temperature, and Bay Gulf pH. And there are some sources listed there recommended by our science partners. And so the next steps would be to have them look at those sources and make recommendations of whether those are the sources that our practitioners should be using. Next slide, please. And so next, these are the climate stressors, which is the conditions, events, or trends related to climate variability and change that can exacerbate the hazards that were listed earlier. So it looks like it got bigger. So one of them is increased air temperature, then increased water temperature, again, sea level rise, extreme rainfall, and ocean acidification. Next slide, please.
Sorry, there we go.
And then again, there's not just climate stressors, there's non-climate stressors, which are the change or trends that are unrelated to climate that can still exacerbate the hazards. So that could include land use change, population growth, nutrient pollution, such as fertilizers, which are interacting with the algal blooms that we had listed as a hazard earlier, land development affecting drainage patterns, and then the pre-existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities that we are going to talk about today. Next slide, please. And so these are the proposed impact indicators, and we'll continue to develop this list as we go through the chapters and think about the impacts to our resources and assets. So impacts are the effect or result of the interaction between the climate phenomena, the hazards, and the vulnerability and exposure. So one of those is exceptional tidal flooding or king tides, vector-borne illness, habitat migration, heat-related illness, harmful algal bloom duration or severity, and changes in growing season and length. And just as a reminder that this list is the list that we presented to the meeting last week. So we've gotten a lot of feedback and we'll continue to build on this list based on that feedback.
And you all can provide feedback onto that as well, so.
And then proposed driver indicators. Drivers are factors that change the Earth's radiative balance. So essentially things that are driving climate change. So GHG emissions, land use, land cover change, sourced from SwiftMud, population change, sourced from Bieber, public opinion on climate change, and our science partners have identified Yale as a source for that data. So again, we'll continue to develop this data as the chapters go on, and this will be an iterative approach. So we'll come back to this chapter as we know more about what we need as far as data as we develop the later chapters. Next slide, is that my,
yes. Thank you. Yeah, so I want to pause here and see if there's any quick questions that you have for Kara that would be important for understanding, you know, setting the stage for what we talk about next. Is there anything regarding, you know, because health, heat bars, whatever, I'm like Halloween, health and heat, or floods and aspects to housing, anything on the technical aspects you want to bring up or ask a question about now. And I see some other questions in the chat about audiences, and I'll just want to re-say that the plan itself, the audience, is really for our leadership, elected officials, business leaders, and community organization leaders, as well as any interested citizen. So it has to be in language that everyone can understand and relate to, and framed in a context that will help us ensure that everyone understands it and supports it. So, all right, let me make sure. I'm going to get into the next thing here. I'm going to shrink the screen, unmute myself. I'm just kidding. So, regional update. Good news, people. Good news. Good morning. And we have just within the last 3 weeks, 2 new members of the regional coalition. So Sarasota County BOCC voted to join that. It should be 7. I have a typo on that. How bad? And Logbook Key. I just got an email from Sean that they voted to, and they approved it yesterday or the day before. So we're very excited. Also, Commissioner Janet Long, who was one of the catalysts early on, we hope will continue to be the chair this year. She was reelected. The appointments to the committees are in January by the incoming Regional Planning Council president. So we continue to get more interest in groups joining that, which is significant. Also, the stakeholder partners are up over 100. If you haven't become a resilient coalition partner, you can go to the website and sign up to do it. I think most of you are. But anyway, so I wanted to do a quick brief update on assessing the progress that's going on around the region. Now, this is not a complete list at all, but the point was to emphasize some of the levels of sea level rise that we're thinking about and why. So Kara mentioned that the CSAP had developed 3 different scenarios and the curves. The one that was the highest level was the NOAA high. And there are a number of counties and cities that have begun using the scenarios through different contexts to assess vulnerability and exposure for critical infrastructure. One of those that the Regional Planning Council was on, which that project is just wrapped up, was with Hillsborough County, Pinellas, and Pasco. Their metropolitan planning organizations for a roads and bridges vulnerability assessment. It was funded by the Federal Highway Administration, which was to look at the vulnerability to roads and bridges up through 2045 to be a part of the long-range transportation plan. In that modeling, and it was a lot of modeling, there was economic impacts, there was all kinds of additional data. So I encourage you to, you'll have access to this PowerPoint presentation, of course, when we're done, but I encourage you to go and read the report. And then if there is specific data you're interested in or your organization is, we can make that FTP available to you. But in that, they looked at, used the NOAA high scenario plus a category 3 storm surge. So when you combine the time of 2045 with NOAA high plus category 3, you really start to see some impacts. Now, I'll just briefly mention the very robust and very large vulnerability assessment that Pinellas County is doing with its infrastructure and coordinating with the local governments within the region. On the community vulnerability assessment side, Hillsborough County, with the support from the University of South Florida, Terran's group completed an in-depth community vulnerability study over the past 2 years, I think, right? And now has drafted mitigation strategies. And I know that there's some other organizations and other local governments working on different pieces of this. So this is really why one of the most significant things we're here to do is to figure out how do we approach these things from a regionally consistent basis that's based on leading science and best practices. So I wanted to just show you briefly, because we talk a lot about floods and issues, and you see a million different screens, but this is out of the Resilient Tampa Bay Transportation Study. The left side, you can see with the light turquoise color is 2019. And then that's a category 1 on the left screen. And then The purple color is up to 2045. So you see that surge goes a little bit further in because of sea level rise. So when you look at a category 3 event, you can see compare the difference between the right side picture and the left side picture, how many more homes, buildings, roads, and areas, acres are impacted under a category 3 than a category 1. And so then you can also see how sea level rise makes things even a bit worse. And when you look at 2045 is the orange dot. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we are starting to know. Now, this is just 25 years down the road. And when you build houses and you build new neighborhoods, we're not building just for 25 years. So this is the kind of, we have to think long-term, and how do we put this into incremental ideas about risk and managing and combining different kinds of flood risk. So it's a quick thing as a part of our parallel flood project, which also included folks from UF and Manatee County. We took a look at the different CRAs in the areas. This one happens to be a map of Pinellas County because it was easy for me to find. And when we started to look at those very same conditions of 2045 and a category 3 and mapping that to community redevelopment areas, and what did we start to learn in terms of who was impacted, number of acres, actual percent of acres in terms of their total CRA. So this gives us something to really think about how we're going to look at what we mean by redevelopment areas and looking at the aspect of the funding that is a part of these programs. And should we keep investing in the same areas, or should we start a very long-term plan for rethinking where we redevelop and develop? So I'm not advocating, I'm just suggesting a lot of thinking needs to be happening. So part of that led to the Resilience for an Energy Assessment of Communities and Housing project, which was funded by JP Morgan Chase. And that's really to helping us bring together the housing resilience, recovery planning, decision makers, community leaders to start to assess the vulnerability and risk to affordable housing, and in particular, the low and moderate income residents that live in these different houses in our communities to extreme weather and sea level rise. And then working through the process of defining strategies and policies. So there's some really high level objectives from that, which are also very dovetailed and integrated to the regional action plan, which is to develop consistent frameworks and methods and metrics for evaluating the people, community vulnerability, and the affordable housing rate. Looking at how we as a region can identify, let's create some standardized approaches for mapping specific aspects of inundation, or defining what do we mean by risk, what do we mean by a resilient zone or area, and then looking at other ways to investigate the challenge of current buildings and energy consumption on families from the beginning. And I worked with Doug over a year ago on some of the early project. How do we really understand ALICE and integrate ALICE into this concept? And then supporting local governments with updates to plans, providing technical training. And ultimately at the end, number 8, which is really our big goal, is to prioritize construction. So increasing the number of units that we have for affordable housing around the region and attainable housing. So there's 3 new tools that are in work. Very excited to share that with you. And early 21, we'll be releasing many of these. Some of these are already in beta forms in process. So the Community Vulnerability Assessment Methodology and User Guide, which will help identify compound factors to evaluate and to map. It'll have a strong component on equity. So what does that mean for this kind of question, as well as other aspects with a focus on housing. So it's not ecosystems, it's not big infrastructure. This is really, as I'm fond of saying it, putting people first, because a lot of the work that's been done on these other things. So it's a way for us to work on a consistent process. So the other part is also being led in the development by the Florida Housing Coalition team on the call, is a housing and resilience plan self-assessment checklist. So enabling housing departments and other planners like LMS and comp planners to cross compare their own initiatives. So it's really a team approach. There'll be webinars. We've already had a few input meetings to get comments on that. And then our colleagues at Schimberg Center have already developed a housing flood risk mapper, which they're going to be working with us in January to I say customize it, and then they've got ideas for some enhancements to the project. So it'll be able to tap into regional modeling and data sets that are there. And we're very excited about that. And that's Bill Odell and Andrea So the last bit of the thing we're excited to talk about is very new, which is what Simone is working on, which is really compiling frameworks and literature reports from around the country on equity in climate and equity in health and equity in housing. So she's compiled a giant spreadsheet. We're organizing that. Meetings have started, for example, with the Pinellas Health and All Policy Planners, learning from them, conversations with Sea Grant folks who've also been involved in equity. And mostly the next step is to get these things onto a whiteboard, so to speak, and at a workshop on December 11th in the morning, the first one, is to really discuss the different frameworks and integrated and what do we need for housing and general community vulnerability. What would we think is important for the region? And then after that, create maps and reports for local governments. So as I mentioned before, we think that the community vulnerability part is significant and important. We recognize the different aspects of our folks from, you know, the very young to the elderly and all the different components, identifying the right data sets and the ways to connect with these things to better understand who we are as a region, what are some of the resilience opportunities, as well as how we can change that. So I'm going to ask you all to send a chat later that says change community vulnerability to community resiliency. So we can, it's important to understand the problems that we're facing or some of the challenges, but I think for all of us to reflect on, we want this to be a positive thing. I just want you to be able to tell that, you know, you can say, we told them to do this. So if you think that's important from framing, please just post it into the chat. Also, the part of the community and where we live is so important to our health and overall resiliency. So housing and neighborhood vulnerability as well as opportunity. So from your typical risks to housing to other factors that impact the neighborhood stability and gaps in amenities that could be changed through resilient adaptation or mitigation. So that's why I'm going to stop here. Any questions about the brief overview, the backgrounding, and before we get into our next presenters? I'm going to see if Kara or Simone or monitor chat. All right. If you think of anything, go ahead and post it, and then we'll come back to it later. So I am delighted to have this next session. We're going to turn it over to Doug Griesenauer. Doug, do you want me to run through your slides with you, or are you going to share your screen?
How about I share my screen? That way I don't next over and over and over again.
Sure. First, I'll just do a quick review. So first, we're going to hear from Doug about Alice, and then we'll hear from Caitlin, who will talk about some community health data that she's put together for us. And then Paul Robinson will touch on building on what Caitlin is saying to look at climate health and the exacerbating impacts on that. So we'll take a break right after Doug before we segue, and then the two health, or not take a break, we will pause to let questions about Alice emerge, and then, no, you don't get out that early, and then we will hear the health people, then we'll take a break. Okay, we're shooting for 10:30, so I think we're on good track here. All right, let me stop sharing and turn it over to Doug.
Now let me start sharing. And so, host participant has disabled screen sharing. So I don't know how to share my screen.
Oh, yeah. Let's make you
I'm not important enough just yet.
And sometimes there's an option under share screen to enable all participants to share. See if you have that option, CJ.
Actually, Kara, can you?
So, well, while technical things are happening, as not to slow on time, I'll do my intro. So really, I want to talk to you all about Alice. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Alice before, are experts on it, or have no clue what I'm talking about. Oh, now I can. Perfect. So now I'm here to talk to you all. So you should see, you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. So I'm here to talk to you all about Alice because ultimately, and you know, CJ said it best, you know, our work here is talking about people first. Talking about the people that's going on. And we can talk about housing in our community, and we should. But in order to do that, you know, understanding housing is really only as important as understanding the people that live in those houses, right? Because these houses aren't just being built for, you know, aesthetic purposes. They're human beings that'll be living in here. And so we need to understand the human beings that are in our community before we, you know, dive deep into the rest of the work. And so as we are all data-minded people, I'm sure a lot of you have seen these charts. I've just pulled this from the Census Quick Facts. And so when we look at understanding our community, obviously we want to be data-centered and science-focused. We go to the data, we go to the facts. The facts here taken from Census, if you look, this is just the traditional quick scope. And you'll notice that income and poverty has 3 lines of everything that's listed in the census. 3 itty-bitty lines of median household income, per capita income, and persons in poverty. And so there's not really a lot of information about poverty that we can collect from traditional means like the census. And on top of that, even the data that's there, for example, persons in poverty, the poverty line, as I'm sure a lot of you know, itself has many flaws, right? It's not geographically based. It does not consider household types outside of size and number. And the model itself is fairly antiquated. And so in order to figure out how we address our community, we need some new tools. And so from this, we come with ALICE. So for those who don't understand, ALICE is an acronym that I consider a very silly acronym to describe some very serious consequences of individuals who are asset limited, income constrained, but employed. That's where the ALICE comes from. Just so you know, all of this data is available at unitedforalice.org/Florida. I'm going to put that in the chat after this, but all of this data is publicly available and encouraged for you all. And the moral of the story of ALICE is that the federal poverty line exists, but it by no means measures what it's supposed to measure anymore. If we're trying to look at how much it actually costs in order to get by in our community, we need to take into consideration the costs of a normal life these days. Things like housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, technology, a 10% overlay, and taxes. And we notice that if you're looking at the federal poverty line, the actual federal poverty line that we have for today, or 2018 for this data, we notice that the federal poverty line for a family of 4 pretty much only covers housing and childcare for real costs of living. And so the understanding of individuals in our community who are struggling to use the federal poverty line would be vastly understating the real scope and the state of our community. And if you doubt that, we can just look at some numbers. And so this is a chart that I'm told to never put in a PowerPoint, but we're all data people, so we'll look at a giant chart of numbers right now. So for example, if you look at the top column, it's breaking it down into types of family households. This is interesting because it's not in normal poverty line. For a federal poverty line, a family of 4 that has 2 adults and 2 kids in childcare is the exact same for the federal poverty line for 2 adults and 2 school-age children. Anyone who has kids in childcare and school-age children know that they're completely different human beings, and therefore they require different costs. So for example, just using my own family, for example, I have 2 adults and 2 children in childcare, which would be that 4th column there. And I want you to let you know these ALICE rates are extremely conservative because housing for that family of 4 is at $939 a month. And childcare for those 2 kids in childcare is listed at $1,162 a month. I speak from experience that if anyone can find me childcare for that rate or a house for that rate in any one of our counties, let me know, right? These are extremely conservative numbers. Take into consideration the bare bones amounts that it would cost. But here's the thing, even using those bare bones amounts of those 2 adults and 2 in childcare, you go all the way to the bottom and it still costs $69,516 to live in Florida, which is $34 an hour. So again, it costs a lot to live in our community. And this is even being conservative with our rates. And so because of that, if you look across all of Florida, the poverty rate in Florida is 13%. But on top of that, there's a 33%, or 1 out of every 3 people in Florida are ALICE. And now CJ mentioned some equity work because we know that those 33% of individuals in ALICE are not all created equal. We know that single parent households struggle considerably more, and single female headed households struggle even more than that, with 39% of all single female headed households in our selected counties. And our selected counties, just so you all know, is this area. I have a little note in the bottom right that says it's Hillsborough, Pinellas, Sarasota, Manatee, Hernando, Citrus, and Pasco counties. So those selected counties have 39% of single female headed households in poverty, but then another 33% on top of that are ALICE, meaning there's only 28%, or a little more than 1 out of every 4 single female households in our community are doing okay. This is important to know as we're talking about building households that are useful for our community. I'm flying through some of these charts just for the sake of time. I want to let you all know you will have access to these charts. So if you want to pour over any one of these slides, feel free to do so, even though I'm flying through. So we'll also look at age. We'll notice that in terms of our communities, families who are the head of household under 25 are significantly more likely to struggle. Now, this is interesting to note because there's actually not a lot of households that are the head of household under 25. It's reasonably a small percentage, but that small percentage is non-zero, right? They still exist and they're still struggling. And what's also fascinating is actually looking at seniors. This is especially true for our Sarasota and Manatee communities that sometimes have older populations. But you'll notice that in our country and in our states and our counties specifically, there's actually a lower rate of over 65 individuals in poverty because we have social safety nets, right? We have things that exist for healthcare for them, Social Security, things like that. But those safety nets do not get people up to a level of stability. They get them out of poverty. And so that's important to note, especially as we're talking about households in our communities and we start looking at our older adult populations. We see that, yeah, only 10% are in poverty. I say only 10%, as if 1 out of 10 people struggling in poverty is a good thing. But keep that in mind that of those 10%, beyond that, another 41% are in this ALICE, under the ALICE survivability threshold. Meaning that only 49%, or about 1 out of every 2 of every single one of our seniors in our communities is struggling with something. This is important information for us to know as we're looking through it. And then lastly, looking at equity, I'm sure it's no surprise that Black and Hispanic households are more likely to be in poverty. This also runs true with ALICE, in which those individuals are most likely to be in ALICE. So here's all this data, but I've been showing you all this data and the methodologies you can pull from unitedforalice.org. But this is all from census data and some Department of Labor, but it's all 2018. And so we know that 2018 data obviously was before COVID. And so I want you to keep in mind that if we look at these areas in our communities, this is all still before COVID, and I'll talk about that in a second. Right now, though, what's cool from United for ALICE is we can pull this on by area and by map. And so I've built specific county populations for each and one of our areas that look, if you, and I'll just give you a quick tour, if you look at the top left, you have some point in time data on this slide. This involves the poverty rate, median household income, the stuff you'll find on the census. But in addition to that, it also talks about ALICE households, unemployment rates, and things like that. Again, this is 2018 unemployment rate. We'd be lucky to be around 5.2% these days. But even with 2018 data, even with our life before COVID, there were still 151,000 households in ALICE or households in Hillsborough County who were in ALICE. And so again, there's a lot of people who talked about pinellas, and so I'll look at pinellas for a second. So there's that information. The bottom left shows the cost of each location because it's different to live in Hillsborough as it is to live in Sarasota, as it is to live in Citrus. So it's unique to each area. And then you tune your eyes to the right, and there's a map now of our community areas, and it's showing the rates of ALICE by each zip code. I've provided for your example the zip code with the highest ALICE rate in each area. You also can go on unitedforalice.org to get a drop down of all of the zip codes. And so you'll see this information is here, and it's true for all of these counties and all of these areas. Again, just going quickly, you'll see that that information is available to anyone who needs it and wants it. So lastly, I want to talk real quickly about some of the data that exists about why individuals are struggling. Well, there's a lot of reasons. So if you're looking at just some data, and now I'm going to start from the past and work our way to the current present. So you start with some past data, 2016, which is a lifetime ago for most of us. But 2016 data, they did a survey of the jobs that are the top 10 and top 20 occupations in Florida and their wages. And we noticed that of the top 10 occupations in Florida, only registered nurses pay an average wage that would get anyone near above that ALICE survivability threshold. When you jump to the top 20 occupations, there's a couple more. For example, supervisors and sales reps that can get you a little closer. But again, those are only a few of the occupations that exist in our community. And so the reason a lot of people are ALICE is that there's data that show that of every single job in Florida, 66% of those jobs pay less than $20 an hour. And so these individuals are in ALICE, or these individuals who are working and working hard are working multiple jobs because they have to. And so in a lot of these data and a lot of this information, we see people are struggling, not because they make bad choices, not because they have levels of incompetence or they've done something that we didn't want them to do. Obviously some have, but that's true across all income spectrums. What we see here are some systemic pieces of information that show us that individuals are working and working hard, but still struggling. And this is important as we start talking about our work and our housing, because there's individuals who are struggling here in a lot of areas. And so as we talk about how we build houses that are successful for them, we need to keep this information in mind. So that was 2016. Let's jump now to now. So 2020 data, if we start looking at our information, I want to look at some quick charts that are now taking COVID into consideration. So unemployment is now currently the highest it's ever been since the Great Depression. The bright side is the Department of Labor says that about 78% of those unemployed report that they've only been temporarily unemployed. So those numbers you'll notice are trending down already and are continuing to trend down a bit. But here's the unfortunate side of this is that even this blip that's happened in 2020, with most people being Alice, they are one paycheck or one mistake away or one cost burden away from getting into some pretty serious trouble. And 2020 was that problem. There are a lot of individuals that are struggling in our community because of what's happening now. And so as we look at housing, we cannot ignore the fact that we live in 2020 and our life looks different. And so here's what's interesting though, is this shows unemployment rates going down. And everyone talks about unemployment and it's an important tool to measure. But here's something even more interesting. This is now looking at the civilian labor force participation rate. You all know this, but to be unemployed, you need to be actively searching for a job, right? That's what unemployment data is, individuals who are actively searching for a job but haven't achieved one. And so while those unemployment rates are high, what's even more shocking is that the civilian labor force participation rate, people who are actually either in jobs or looking for jobs, has been decreasing. And it's been decreasing for a decade or more. But we noticed now that COVID hit, there was a huge drop and then a slight recovery, but nowhere near what it was before. And so this shows that unfortunately the civilian labor force participation, people who are even in the labor force, has been going down, but things and communities that have hit hardest are those communities that have been hit with Alice because of COVID. So for example, you look at leisure and hospitality, kind of a big deal for our community. That was hit the hardest with comparing year over year, August 2019 to August 2020. They have lost 3.8 million jobs in 1 year. And so again, when we're talking about the impacts of COVID, these are impacts on things that are widespread and are things that are impacting people in our community specifically. And I think the most specific way, let's fast forward even to now. And so this is data from the census, there's a household pulse survey data. Now, of course, they mentioned that it's a household pulse survey over the course of a week. So it's not as robust as their American Community Survey or their decennial survey, of course. But it's still data from the survey, from the census, and it still tracks with information. And if you're looking at Florida, they asked every homeowner in Florida, or a representative population in Florida, what is the likelihood of them leaving their home due to a foreclosure in the next 2 months? And of that, half of the people said not likely at all. They're in their homes, they're great, they're fantastic. But 1 out of 5, so 20%, if you add together the very likely and somewhat likely, 1 out of 5 of every single homeowner in Florida believes it's very likely or somewhat likely that they will be foreclosed upon in the next 2 months. And now let's look at renters. For renters, nearly half of all renters in Florida believe it is very or somewhat likely that they will be foreclosed upon in the next 12 months. This is as of October 12th, the week of October 12th. So that's what, 2 weeks ago when they did this survey. And 12% believe it's very likely and 37% believe it's somewhat likely that they will be foreclosed upon and they will be out of their apartment in the next 12 months. So again, if we start talking about housing, you can't talk about housing without talking about the people who live in those houses. And if we're talking about resiliency and talking about making sure that people are being okay, you have to take into consideration 2020 because a lot of people are not okay. And COVID, for a lot of us is going to be a blip. It's going to be a year or two in some cases of struggle, and then we'll get through. But some of these individuals in our community, it's a disaster in the very real sense of the word. And so again, I present this data to you all. Some of it's information you know, some of it's information hopefully you don't, so that's at least a little useful to you. But it's something that we can use to build on this. And so lastly, I just want to end on an accurate understanding of ALICE thresholds should inform how we address affordable and attainable housing in this work. We have to understand our community, especially as CJ mentions us being data informed. We got to have the right data in front of us to make the right decisions. And so a couple questions I throw to you all. We're not going to answer these right now, but how does extreme weather and climate change impact our ALICE population? Things to think about is how can we address the intersectionality of housing and transportation and social vulnerability through that information that I just talked about? Or what additional data is needed to understand that intersection between what we just talked about of ALICE and then your all's levels of expertise of health, equity, and resiliency planning and those pieces. And so again, that's that information. Does anyone have any questions? We have a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, Doug, can you explain why the health cost more than doubles as you move, it's slide 37, 1 adult to 2 adults?
Yes. Which one are you looking at?
There you go. 4th line down, healthcare. 1 adult, single adult is 200, 2 adults is 507.
So you can look through that through the methodologies. And what's really nice is that all of this information is built through, and actually, since I'm sharing my screen, how about this? In real time, let's show you how to, so what you do is you can go to unitedforalice.org. And what is interesting is they list out the methodologies as listed in very explicit detail for each of our data points. And so what you can do is you can go to United for Alice and specifically look for Florida. And what we can do is you can look at the methodologies here. And we can pull down specifically where they came from as we're looking for our 2020 report. And so we can go down then to healthcare and bring this all through the household budgets. And so when we're looking at healthcare, and I only say this because I haven't memorized, this is a 12, 100 and something page document. So you can pull it through. So healthcare budget. So it's their hardest to estimate. So it could be changing that. So they look at health insurance premiums, out-of-pocket costs. They look at Kaiser Family Foundation survey that looks at low-income households, which add additional costs on top of that. They look at health insurance premiums. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but you can be able to find this information here. I don't have the answer directly to that question, but you'd be able to find it here.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
So Doug, if you can post a link to Alice for Florida into the chat, that would be great. I think this is the big quest for us, for the region and for all local governments, is to figure out how we can begin to consistently refer to this. What appeals to me is because of the equity issues we have, certain sections of people who are anti-poor. So the understanding of workforce and the level of employed, and that means poor who accept public aid poor. Let me just make that as a statement. There's the social, issues that we have in that. So the component of helping the regional leadership as well as the development to understand the size of Alice as a percent of our population is significant, and the level of kind of cost burden. Doug, I would ask that you come up with a real world version of Alice by, I can't imagine finding, as you say, an apartment. So we have the Pinellas County data, $1,100 for a real world apartment and for Alice. So one question I have for you to clarify, and then we need to go into the other ones, is the $34 an hour or whatever it was at the bottom. So that's for 2 people earning that income, or is that 1 person earning? So how does that 34 factor into the 2-person household?
So it's both, it's yes and, right? And so it is for that household, the household costs. And so when you looked at that slide about single parent households struggling more, one of the obvious answers is that if you have a single parent household, you have only 1 earner income. And so yes, if you have 2 individuals who are both working, you can divide that 34 in half, and you can cut that down to $17 an hour. Keeping in mind, you're now talking about $17 an hour for 2 individuals working. And we know that 66% of all Florida jobs pay less than $20 an hour, right? So yes, family 2 earner households are more likely to be above Alice, but there still is a strong population of that is struggling.
Yeah, I think there's some, from a perspective of, the optics and explaining this aspect of that 34, and there's 2 people working, it's really 17, or it's a different phenomena. And also what you didn't bring up as much was, we've heard in other talks, was this aspect of the gig economy. And when they're saying working, 2 to 3 jobs per person, and maybe some of them are doing pretty well because they're driving for Amazon Prime right now or something. And I'm just joking. But the idea is, what are the impacts of COVID, the economic, on these different gig components, right? Some gigs are worse, some gigs are, busier. So I think the idea is, You know, that was a good question. So bringing up the minimum wage, which takes 3 to 5 years to get there, Ron, I think. So I think the point of this is that the role of using the United Way as a data resource to help us identify and use standardized approaches in our community vulnerability analyses for resilience is like the big takeaway here. How we get at those other cost data, bits of data, we can use the different underlying data sources, and that's a key thing. So,
and the one last thing I would add, and I can talk for an hour on this stuff, so I won't. Because we have lots of important things to talk about. But the one other thing is, because a lot of the questions you all asked about, well, what about these households and what about these groups? This ALICE data is corroborated by MIT's cost of living calculator and cost of living index. And so what's cool is that, so we provide graphs and charts and information like that. But if you want to delve down really closely and say, I am a single adult, I have a high schooler, I have a 3-year-old, I have a senior mother that I take care of. What is my cost? You can actually put all that into MIT's cost of living calculator, and they can spit out for you, this is what you need, which is always nice. And it's always nice that, you know, when your data is corroborated by MIT. You can use that information, especially as you all are teasing out those specific questions that you're looking for.
Great, thanks, Doug. I need a time check from Kara or Simone, since I don't have the thing open in front of me. And then, Caitlin, are you going to present from this? You want me to, or you're going to present from your own desktop?
I can go either way. Since you already have it up, in the interest of time, we can have you move my slides forward.
Thank you.
Let me move this so that I can see.
It's 10:12, CJ. Is that what you're asking for?
Where are we supposed to be? That's where I'm.
You didn't put times next to the presentations, but the break is supposed to be at 10:30.
Okay. All right. We will try to move forward on that. Not crushing you guys. Maybe we'll take the break about 5 minutes late then. Thank you.
I will try to move quickly. So again, I'm Caitlin Murphy. I am a health planner program coordinator with Pinellas County. And I think Doug just set us up really well with his conversation about ALICE and about how that affects household stability, because without having a roof over your head, without having a good paying job, without having the ability to pay for expenses like healthy food, how are you supposed to be healthy, right? So today, my agenda, I want to quickly define health. I want to review the region's health status, how healthy are we overall, and then let's look at a few climate-related health outcome indicators. And then quickly talk about health in all policies, or HIAP, and the social determinants of health frameworks. So first of all, what is health? It means different things to different people. So you can take a minute to think about what it means to you. The image on the right comes from a community meeting that our Health in All Policies Collaborative actually held in Pinellas County back in 2019, when you could still meet in person. So when we asked this question of people, these are some of the responses you got. Everything from happiness to wellness, equity, peace, freedom, wide variety of answers. And of course, all of these are valid. CJ, if you want to just click through it 3 times, I think you can just put all my text up there. That works. Okay, so, and then health is obviously more than healthcare. So when we talk about the actual definition of health, the World Health Organization defines health as the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So this means, I think a lot of times people think about health as being sick or not sick, but it's a lot more than that. It's how are you feeling emotionally and mentally on that day? It's what kind of social connections do you have to get you through hardship, and what makes you resilient, right? So, and then lastly, health is for everyone. So this is that idea of health equity. Health equity means that everyone in our community has a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, regardless of their background, right? So you can go to the next slide, CJ. Thank you. So let's dive deeper quickly into that concept of health equity for a moment. Both of these maps show you life expectancy for census tracts. They use the same data source. There's a link, so you can always go explore your own neighborhood later if you're interested in that. The map on the left specifically shows St. Petersburg, and the map on the right shows our region as a whole, so all the counties within the coalition. They have slightly different legends, so make sure you're looking at the corresponding legend. So St. Petersburg, specifically on the left, has a life expectancy of 76.8 years. That compares to an average of 79 across the 500 large cities that are included in this dashboard, the City Health Dashboard. But what I really want to highlight here, life expectancy in St. Pete ranges from 84 years in the census tracts that have the lightest color. So you can see some of those in the Northeast area, tends to have higher incomes. And then the range goes as low as 66 years in the darker census tracts to the south. So you can see there's that one census tract that's very dark in the bottom of the graph. And if you overlaid this map with some of the maps that Doug showed earlier, you would see some of the things that he was highlighting related to income and access to resources correspond with these life expectancy rates, right? So that range of 66 to 84, that's almost 20 years. I certainly want those extra 20 years. I think everybody else does as well. So you can see that these inequities exist throughout the region if you look at the map on the right. And they exist for other health indicators. So you'll see these things for heart disease, asthma, diabetes. You see this for coronavirus right now. So why are some neighborhoods different and what causes these health inequities? You can go to the next slide, CJ. So these differences in health outcomes are due to different conditions in the cities and the communities in which we live that are known as the social determinants of health. So social determinants of health are the conditions in which we live, work, and play on a daily basis. These conditions go beyond what takes place in a doctor's office or a hospital or a public health department. And local governments actually have a large role to play in influencing the social determinants of health through the plans, the policies, the programs, and the projects. We talk about the 4 Ps in health and all policies that we create every day. So decisions that we're making in the Regional Resilience Action Plan and the decisions that you all are making in your day-to-day work influence the social determinants of health. And I also want to highlight that this framework focuses not on individual behavior, but on the whole context for health. So similar to some of what Doug was talking about, again, why do people make healthy or unhealthy choices? It's not always up to them. It's about the conditions in which they live that make a healthy choice an easier choice or a harder choice. So in order to achieve health equity that we were talking about earlier, we have to remove obstacles such as poverty, discrimination, lack of access to good jobs. We need to put in place things like quality education and housing and safe environments and give people access to resources that they need. Next slide. So now I'm going to go through a few health indicators for our community quickly. Sorry, Sarasota, you're not on here, but you can find the data at the source that you are, that I'll provide you at the end. There's some data sources that I'm going to link you to. So I want to start with overall health status that you can see here, and then we'll look specifically at a couple climate-related health indicators for our region. This data comes from a survey that takes place every few years that the Center for Disease Control and local departments of health, the Florida Department of Health, conduct of adults within counties across Florida. So in this question in particular, adults were asked how they would rate their own health, everything from excellent down to poor. So the data that's displayed on the screen is those who said that their health was good or better. And you can see that in our region for physical health specifically, approximately 81 all the way up to about 88% of adults say that their health was good at the time of the survey. So that's relatively good. You can see that that kind of corresponds with the Florida average. Some counties in our region are a little bit lower than others. But you also have to think about what the kind of inverse of that means. That means anywhere from 10 to 12% of adults are saying that their health is not good on a daily basis. And then you can look at the same thing for mental health, anywhere from about 85 to 88, 89% of adults say they have good mental health. But the takeaway here is that if you're starting with good health to begin with, it's easier for you to bounce back and be resilient in the case of some kind of disaster or hazard or emergency event. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a few health indicators that can specifically be affected by climate change. And Dr. Robinson is going to talk a little bit more in detail about how that happens later on. So respiratory health, this can encompass a broad range of conditions. It can be affected by viruses like the coronavirus as we're seeing right now. But of course, it can also include chronic conditions like asthma or COPD. And all of these respiratory conditions can be affected by conditions in our environment. Again, going back to social determinants of health. So the air quality within your home can affect how you are experiencing your asthma and whether you develop asthma in the first place as a child. And those dealing with asthma or COPD can experience very severe episodes that are bad enough that they can require hospitalization or emergency department visits. And that can be triggered by things like air pollution, which can be worsened by climate change. It's important to look at that. Again, across our region, in this table, you've got adults on the left-hand side and children, students of middle and high school age on the right-hand side. So slightly lower rates of asthma in adults because sometimes children do outgrow asthma. But you can see that for children, it's about 1 in 10 children in our area dealing with asthma. So how does climate change impact that? Are we going to see those rates grow down the line? And then something else that I want to highlight here, this COVID-19 data is from Unite Pinellas. So this is showing you case rates and hospitalization rates for COVID-19 by race and ethnicity since the start of the pandemic. So you can see some pretty drastic variations by race and ethnicity for both people getting COVID-19 and then being hospitalized for COVID-19. If you looked at death rates, you would see these kinds of differences as well. So the Black population has significantly higher rates of getting the virus and being hospitalized, and then compared to the white population in particular, which has the lowest rates. But you'll also see that those that fall within Hispanic or other race or ethnicity experience higher rates and more severe consequences of this disease as well. Next slide, please. Okay, heart disease. So this can be any kind of disorder that affects the heart's ability to function. So there are a variety of things that fall within this category, but the map on the right shows you heart disease death rates specifically. So the number of deaths per 100,000 people within a county. And you can see that some of the more rural counties tend to have higher rates of heart disease. So again, going back to social determinants of health, what factors are at play here that are influencing that? Heart disease is also one of the leading causes of death in both the United States and Florida. So that you'll see if you're looking at leading causes of death in communities across the nation, heart disease and cancer are typically 1 and 2. They kind of flip back and forth. Both of those things can be affected and worsened by climate change, I think, as Dr. Robinson's probably going to highlight a little bit more later on. Next slide, please. Heat-related illness. So this one, I think for some people has a more obvious connection to climate change, but this is any kind of illness where the body struggles to regulate its own temperature. So they can be mild to severe, requiring a visit to an emergency department or even hospitalization. So the map on the right-hand side of the screen specifically shows the number of heat-related emergency department visits during summer months. So this is not accounting for all heat-related illness. I want to remind you of that because the numbers might not be particularly striking. You can see in some counties nearby, it's tens to hundreds. Hillsborough is in the hundreds in terms of the number of emergency department visits. But again, this doesn't count milder cases that might go to urgent care or might not necessarily need to see a doctor. It also doesn't count more severe cases that require hospitalization. So if this is what our region already looks like as temperatures change over time, how does that affect the heat-related illness that we see down the line? Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I'd like to just briefly go over the Health in All Policies framework as a framework for incorporating health and equity into our work. So HIAP, Health in All Policies, or HIAP, is a collaborative approach to improving the health of all people within our community by incorporating health and equity considerations into decision-making across sectors and policy areas. So again, it's going back to that idea, health is more than what happens in the doctor's office. It's about that spectrum of social determinants, a lot of which Doug talked about earlier. So HIAP raises awareness of social determinants of health and helps communities develop methods to reduce health barriers and increase health equity. It breaks down silos and it helps us identify new partnerships, something that Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council is obviously already doing through this initiative. It also approaches things through a systems perspective. So rather than trying to change a single decision, we're trying to change the way that we think about decision making, analyzing all of our proposed policies, plans, programs, and projects for their potential impact on health. And TBRC is already doing some of the things that we need to implement HIAP. So creating health and equity related goals is already something they're looking at for the RRAP, identifying health impacts of climate change, measuring changes in health and climate related health outcomes. You can go to the next slide. I just noticed the time, so I'm gonna try and go quickly through. I only have 2 slides left. So this last slide shows you county health rankings. It compares counties within the same state against each other to show overall health status. So looking at length of life, how long we live, and quality of life, how well we live. So you can see this is out of 67 counties in Florida, with number 1 being the healthiest. We have a wide range within the counties within our region. But the main point here is that the programs that we put in place by considering health and equity can allow people to make healthier choices and bring us toward a healthier community, which makes us more resilient in the long run. So if there are questions, I can answer those later. The next slide is simply a list of data resources that you all can come back to later. I'm not going to talk through this one, but if you're curious about some of the data I talked about, you've got some health-related data resources here.
Great, thank you, Kayla. That was fantastic. I know we do have a variety of questions, but the interest of getting Paul up and running. Paul, I'll just present and you can tell me next slide, okay?
Okay. I'm Paul Robinson. I represent and I'm a spokesperson for the Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. Can you see the pointer?
No, I'm sure I have the.
Okay, well, this slide is from the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, a fellowship of 27 medical societies, including, well, I won't go into that, but depending upon what part of the country we are in, there are different major impacts of climate change on human health today. And I'm not talking about in the future, impacts on human health today. In the southeastern part of the United States, the major impacts include extreme heat, air pollution, vectors of disease, extreme weather, waterborne diseases, and mental health impacts. Next slide, please. Let's start with extreme heat. Heat waves kill more human beings than any other climate-related emergency, and they are increasing in frequency and in severity. The number of emergency department visits for heat-related illness increased by 133% in the United States over a 10-year period. Some groups of individuals are more susceptible to extreme heat and heat waves than others. These include people with disabilities on the left, people who are pregnant or infirm. In the middle, elderly people often have trouble perceiving heat and cold properly, and in hot weather, you may see them layering up in clothing when they're inside. On the far right, athletes, particularly those who practice and who compete outdoors, are at particular risk, as are outdoor workers. In fact, look at the guy in the football helmet and imagine that you're working in a trauma center a few years ago and you get a call over the radio. The paramedics are bringing in a teenager that they say is suffering from heat exhaustion. When they roll him through the door on a stretcher, it's very clear that that is not the condition. He is in a coma, his skin is hot, and his internal temperature is 107. We tried, this is a real person, representative of several. This was during August, and this high school football player had been in the second of 2 practices when the heat index was above 100 degrees. This guy had a temp of 107, as I mentioned. We tried external cooling, it had no effect. So we went to internal cooling. I put a subclavian line with large bore in his right chest, and we started pushing iced saline into his veins. The nurses dropped a nasogastric tube into his stomach, and they were lavaging his stomach with ice water. I intubated him with an endotracheal tube, and we were running the oxygen cannula through an ice bath. So we were hitting him. We also immersed him in salt water, in ice water, not salt water. So we were using multiple methods. After about an hour and a quarter, his temp had dropped to 101.5, but he was still in a coma. I saw him the next morning and gave him some advice that he didn't like, which was no more football and no more exercise outside. In fact,
Paul,
high school and yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt because it's a great background, but we really need for you to stay at a high level perspective so that we can ask you more questions at the end. So
you want me to go faster, CJ?
Yeah, perhaps less in the medical detail for us here and more on the dynamic impacts, because there's so much for you to cover.
Okay.
Sorry.
High school and college football players are up to 11 times more likely to suffer from severe heat illness than others. Next slide, please. Okay, let's just look at the number 150,000 in the right upper corner. This is a projection of how many Americans could die by the end of this century if we continue with business as usual. And that is almost certainly an understatement. Heat illness precipitates other kinds of illnesses like heart failure, respiratory failure, and those often end up being the final diagnoses. Next slide, please. Looking at Florida, this is a projection for increases in heat index in Florida's 12th district, where I'm sitting right now. If you look at the lower part of the slide, 100-degree Fahrenheit heat index right now, we typically have about a month of the year. By mid-century, we can anticipate 4 months of the year in which the number of days in which the heat index is 100 degrees or higher. Again, it would be about 4 months. If we look at 105 degrees heat index by mid-century, we can anticipate between 2 and 3 months of days in which the heat index would be that high. So the projections are quite significant. Next slide, please. Increasing heat from climate change causes a worsening of our inhaled air by multiple mechanisms. Increasing heat causes smog or precipitates smog. Increasing heat also increases the production of pollen by various plants. Increasing heat also predisposes to wildfires. Between October of 2016 and June of 2017, Florida suffered a 100-year drought. During that period in Tampa Bay, there were only about 5 inches of rain total. The normal would be 16 to 24. Between January and June of 2017, there were more than 2,000 wildfires across Florida. The Evans Road fire that occurred in 2008 lasted for 3 months. There was an article in the Annals of Emergency Medicine that looked at the number of visits downwind versus upwind for respiratory conditions. Not surprisingly, the number of, as Caitlin mentioned, the number of cases of asthma and COPD increased by 50% downwind versus upwind. Interestingly enough, the number of visits for cardiovascular conditions also increased by 50% downwind versus upwind. It would be interesting, I think, to look at more recent data of the wildfires in 2017 to see downwind versus upwind data. Just another tidbit, a publication by Wu et al. From Harvard this year, 2020, showed that just a slight increase of particulate matter, what we call PM 2.5s, which reach the bottom of the lungs, go into respiratory physiology, can markedly increase the risk of COVID-19, both the risk of contracting it and the dangers and the risks of lethality from it. Next slide, please. Okay. I will only use this slide in the interest of time to mention that increasing CO2 in our atmosphere makes pollen more allergenic. Next slide, please. Okay. If you look at the brown semicircle at the top, that's obviously the south end of a north moving tick. Increasing temperatures have had an interesting effect upon the geographic distribution of various arthropods. The geographic distribution, for example, of the black-legged tick that carries Lyme disease and other diseases has doubled in 10 years. And the major disease that we think about that they carry has also doubled. Next slide, please. The bullseye rash on the left is pathognomonic of Lyme disease stage 1. It's called erythema chronicum migrans. And I've seen this multiple times in Florida, as a matter of fact, although Lyme is not as prevalent here. Look at the mosquito above it. The geographic range of certain types of mosquitoes like Aedes genus mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus, that carry Lyme, that carry chikungunya, Zika, dengue fever, yellow fever, has increased dramatically up the eastern seaboard to New England for one species and into Canada for another. Increasing heat also has an effect upon the behavior of certain mosquitoes. Aedes aegypticus, that likes to live in our homes with us, bites more often as the temperature rises, and they take more blood meals, and we are their only food. You can see in the graph the increase in the number of tick-borne and mosquito-borne diseases over time from 2004 to 2016. Next slide. Okay. Increasing temperature and climate change have had 4 major effects upon our water. Our water is warmer. The seas have risen. Our ocean water is 30% more acidic than it was in 1970. And downpours are more frequent and more voluminous. If you look at the clouds on the upper left, they're again increasing frequency and intensity of precipitation. And this can cause increasing runoff, and both from residential areas, dog and cat, other pet droppings, but also livestock feces runoff into our water. And this can trigger a growth of diseases, bacteria, viruses, and single-celled protozoa. There was a gentleman in Tarpon Springs last year who was written up in the Tampa Bay Times, who was fishing standing thigh deep in water in the Anclote River in, I believe it was late spring. And the next day he was in the hospital with an infection in his right leg that caused discoloration of the skin, caused bully or fluid-filled sacs within the skin, severe pain, fever, a life-threatening disease that the media likes to refer to as flesh-eating bacteria. The organism is Vibrio vulnificus. It likes to live in warm, brackish water. And as the water is warming, it increases exponentially. Runoff can also carry, of course, fertilizers, etc., from farm areas and from residential areas. And this can cause algae blooms, shown here in the middle. Next slide, please. So as the warmth and the acidity of our water increases, but also as we have increasing runoff, we can end up with green slime or cyanobacteria, red slime, red tide, and flesh-eating bacteria. Next slide, please. Okay. We're missing a slide. I don't know how I did that to you, but the slide that's missing showed 16 weather catastrophes that occurred in 2017 that caused each at least $1 billion to the country. It also showed for the Gulf region 3 Category 4 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The first time in recorded history that 3 Cat 4 storms hit the United States in 1 year. Disasters are becoming more frequent, and they're becoming more intense. It looks like we're going to exceed the number of hurricanes in 2020 that occurred in 2005 when the last record was broken. When we think about fatalities from disasters like hurricanes, etc., we tend to think about immediate things like drowning and crushing deaths from trees landing on houses or cars, or we think about electrocution from power lines coming down. But secondary deaths are a very significant contribution, and these can happen when partially, quote unquote, treated sewage is released into water like Tampa Bay. But it can also occur because people can't get access to their necessary medicines like insulin or their cardiac medicines. It can occur when they can't get power to medical devices that they need to survive. And there's an additional long-term effect. Next slide, please. Okay. CJ, if you'll permit me, I want to mention another patient that I saw who was a refugee from Katrina. And at the time I was working in a city which was a major relocation center for those refugees. This woman was brought in a coma by medics. She had taken an overdose of drugs. We saw a lot of these people. They had lost their homes, they'd lost relatives, they'd lost friends, they'd lost their entire life, and they were bereft. And then in 2005, in our state, Tropical Storm Rita rolled right through our city, and these people were traumatized all over again. There have been studies that show a remarkable difference in the incidence of suicide attempts among refugees from major storms like that. And it's like 77 times more likely to attempt suicide. By the way, that woman did survive. If you look at the insert, Eye on America, months and even a year after Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle, school children had to be counseled or comforted when even a minor rainstorm rolled through. Next slide, please. Okay. So mental health problems can be precipitated by climate change and by major disasters particularly, and these can last for months to years. And these include not only stress, depression, anxiety, suicidal attempts, etc., but also increases in violence and social disruption. Okay, if there are any questions and I have time for them, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you've given us a tremendous amount of information to think about. I want to just make one comment on that while folks are thinking of their question about the mental health piece that I heard when actually Gladys and I were at the APA Florida last year about what happened when Michael hit Mexico Beach, and the loss of schools on children and the loss of juvenile service centers, that they were having to move children who needed psychological, social services care to counties that were 3 and 4 hours away because they didn't have any mental health resources. And so they were busing. And so the exacerbation of the impacts to these was much bigger and much more longer lasting. So thank you for bringing up the issue of how long these impacts can be, because a lot of people are, we haven't had, knock on wood, something in our area. So I'm going to ask for folks for questions now. We can talk about health, and then we'll, let's say we're about 10 minutes behind, but I want to allow you guys the questions for both Ashley, or excuse me, Caitlin, about health and all policies, which I think is particularly, we're at a perfect opportunity for figuring out what health in policies looks like in the context of changing climate, in the context of resilience and disaster preparedness. And it also touches on sustainability, the positive side of it. So any big thoughts or questions, like gut reactions, what should the regional action plan consider that you think was something that resonated? I know we got a lot of stuff to process. Pretty heavy duty too.
Hey, CJ.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, how are you? I apologize for joining late. I was at that City Tampa meeting on the 100% resolution. I guess the point is Dr. Robinson, can you sort of speak to some of the costs, and I mean the literal costs, because as we talk about climate and the impacts and what were the costs of the impact we're seeing, and you've just illustrated a bunch of them and they're expensive. On the other side, the argument sometimes is, well, gee, it costs too much, which is not true at all, because it doesn't cost any more to transition to clean energy than we would pay for traditional. But I just, if you could just speak to some of the cost piece, I think policymakers pay attention to that.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I wish I hadn't somehow deleted the slide that showed the $16 billion plus catastrophes in 2017, because they go all the way across the country, from wildfires in California to Irma and Maria in our part of the country. Usually that argument that you mentioned is one-sided. And what you hear is, gee, it's going to cost so much to upgrade our infrastructure, or gee, it's going to cost so much to improve our seawalls, or use preferably living shorelines. But it needs to be balanced against how much is it going to cost in 30 years if we don't do these things. There's a very interesting paper out there called Underwater by the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows the projection for loss of tax base for cities along the west coast of Florida. And we're talking perhaps 40% to 60% of a reduction in tax base in municipalities on this coast of Florida within the time frame of a standard mortgage taken out today. Something else to think about. You look at any of the sustainability plans in the state of Florida, and you'll find exhortations to the public that you should be riding your bicycles more, and you should be walking more. You should. The Greek term is peripeto. How many people are going to ride their bikes, and how many people are going to walk outside or walk to local stores when the heat index is 105? We are going to have to find a way. And how many people are going to shop in our cities and our towns when the heat index is 105 or higher? It seems to me we have to find ways to cool our streets, to cool our homes and our businesses, to cool our citizens, and do it without burning fossil fuels. So the economics of this yes, it leads us off in many directions, and it's a great question and a good argument.
And I'll just add to that really quickly. One cost that we definitely already have available to us is the cost of an emergency department visit or a hospitalization due to some of the health-related conditions that Dr. Robinson and I were talking about. So we can go see the average cost of an asthma-related ED visit. And you know, emergency department visits can vary from a couple $1,000s to tens of thousands of dollars. So what does that look like if asthma cases increase by 10%? That's a great question.
So one of the things we'll need to figure out is the cost of things and who pays for them. There's, I think, a lot of hidden costs. So emergency room visits, when you have insurance versus emergency room visits, and they're not. And so this is where we may want to develop some more robust economic analysis. And I forgot to mention that Randy DeShazo, our supervisor, is working on a impacts of extreme heat report as a part of the EPA grant and looking at different aspects. And also I wanted to bring up, I just saw something yesterday because we have a different grant, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is trying to develop, I mean, Paul, there's an opportunity for cross collaboration also with the health folks, is the quantify or define at least the secondary impacts of power outages post-disaster. So we've started a list of metrics. We know that, you know, diesel generators provide or create a lot of particulate themselves. There's a lot of information out of post-Maria for Puerto Rico, but we may have an opportunity to collect a brain trust to help us define the metrics to make the case for solar plus storage and microgrids for use on emergency shelters, specific operation buildings. Right now, you can just use the case for energy efficiency. What we're trying to define, create a new tool that helps us define how you as a local government, how you as a nonprofit who have a building, or even a private sector person can put a resilience benefit value add on top of your existing energy efficiency gains. So I think these aspects about hidden cost impacts on, of course, when you shorten life expectancy. Caitlin, there was an interesting thing I saw in there. Citrus County had the shortest lifespan of our counties, but they also felt that in their survey, they felt that they were in good physical health and good mental health. So I think you know, I come out of the market research side, so I'm always like sort of skeptical about how people, you ask me today and I'm like, yay, my mental health is good. Ask me tomorrow, it might not be so good. So looking at attitudes and perspectives versus concrete data that we can collect, what's behind a much shorter life expectancy. Also, the other piece I wanted to add on about asthma, which I didn't see us talk about, is the link between poverty, certain areas of low and moderate income housing, substandard housing, air quality, and asthma inside there. I came from Chicago. There was some notorious public housing facilities that had massive impacts of childhood asthma because of exposure to roaches and rat feces. So the air quality within substandard housing compounded with mold and other things may be, you know, I don't know if we'll have more bugs. Will we have more roaches because of climate change or heat? I don't know, but
yeah, and one more thing to add to that too is that living near a busy roadway increases the likelihood that a child develops asthma. So, and that's not just a correlation link. There are studies now that show that as being causative. So add that into everything you were just saying, CJ, and kids that are living in communities where there's substandard housing are probably also living in communities where they have more exposure to that other kind of air pollution.
So that I'm going to ask the health gurus, because that link to data, so the greenhouse gas emissions due to transportation, we hear now the issue of proximity. How close do you have to be? So in specific metrics that we can measure are things that we'll want to need. So when you get into breakout sessions where you might have some thoughts about how we're going to integrate health impacts and climate drivers into this plan, connecting between increased road vehicle miles, increased drive, increased heat, increased pollution. What do we mean by proximity? I lived for a while about 2 blocks from 275. And I would have to like get up and dust off my picnic table. This was when I first moved to Tampa. I was like, what's on? Oh my God, you know. So I get it when you say it's not a good thing. There's particulates, it's there, it's obvious. But
just quickly on that note, for anyone who's not familiar with the health data, there is already data from Florida Department of Health out there that tracks households that live within 500 feet of a busy roadway. They define busy as having a volume, I think, of more than 25,000 cars a day. So definitely something like 275. And then also specifically, I think they look at child and daycare centers within 500 feet of a busy roadway. So taking into account that children vulnerability aspect.
Oh, this is brilliant. This is exactly in terms of also health and equity connections that we'll want to have you share as a link to how we start to measure this thing. So any other connections that you guys have sparked between impacts, risks, populations?
TJ, I have a general question for the health folks. Is there relatively granular information available about the relationship between heat and housing location and health outcomes? I say that in part because right now our application is one-dimensional. It's a flood hazard, coastal flood hazard application, but we want to start incorporating additional hazards. But we're looking for fairly granular information, and heat seems like something that y'all have begun to emphasize more so. And I'm just wondering to what extent that there are not only strong correlations between actual location, but also granular information that would suggest vulnerability or exposure to heat.
There is information about urban heat index effect. I can't think of where to send you right now, but other than that, I don't have a good answer to that question. I'm sorry.
This is really good question, and I think we'll have a list of the heat connectivity to things. There is the urban heat island. There's aspects of measuring concrete density or in the converse tree canopy. There's multiple levels that you could potentially look at. What do you mean by heat or protective measures? So, and we're like half an hour behind, so I apologize. I want to give us a break. Thank you to Paul and Caitlin and Doug. We've got a lot of things to think about, a lot of new data, and this has been very exciting. So how about if we give everybody a 10-minute break instead of 15? So come back at 10 after 10, and make sure you have, before you leave, that you have signed up for a specific breakout group. So that was posted in the chat, and then we'll put you into that. So we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Are you seeing the two housing presenters?
Yes, we are.
Okay. But I turned my video off. Let's get that fixed. Sorry. There I am. Oh. Yeah, it's so funny. It kind of disappears. There. Oh, okay. All righty. So good morning, everybody. This has been fascinating to listen to. For this section here, I'm Gladys Cook, the Disaster Resilience and Recovery Director for the Florida Housing Coalition. And Andrea Galinsky from University of Florida will present just after I do. Tiny Commercial Florida Housing Coalition is a statewide nonprofit organization, and we do technical assistance and training. And we're a very proud member of the REACH team. And two of our other people, Juanita Jones and Alyssa Plancher, are here with us today. So I'm just going to do some, just focus on a couple of housing principles that we're trying to shift over to as we look at housing resilience. This isn't a class in affordable housing, so I'm just gonna show you a little bit about that too. But housing is infrastructure. Some people think, well, it's a place for homes and families and socialization, but I found this great quote. I'll just read it into the record here. It's from the Global Resilience Institute. Housing is a necessity a choice, a financial investment, and a human right. For many communities, their housing supply, affordability, and quality are the invisible infrastructure that supports growth, vitality, sustainability, inclusion, and resilience. Solutions to housing issues must be examined within the overall community economic ecosystem so that underlying interdependent factors affecting housing choice, availability, and affordability are also addressed. And we also have a citation here from a congressional action stating that housing is infrastructure. So the, and when the types of housing that are done by housing providers, there's direct to people, and that's where people can get down payment assistance or they can have their home repaired, or for permanent supportive housing where people who have vulnerabilities have a place to live with the proper supports. And the indirect part would be to developers to assist and subsidize housing for new construction of homeownership or multifamily so that the costs are brought down. So there's an investment there. So these are the basic terms. Affordability means that your housing costs, including utilities, shouldn't exceed 30% of your gross income. We know that homeowners go up to around 40, 45% when you add everything in, but 30% has just been the traditional benchmark for affordability. If you spend more than that on housing, more of that your income on housing, then you don't have it for transportation and medicine and schools and things like that. We also use AMI, area median income, and that is published by HUD every year. It's the median annual gross household income for a metropolitan area or sub area or MSA. And it's based on the size of family from 1 through 8. So cost burden means that you're paying more than 30% of your gross income on housing costs. And a severe cost burden means you're paying 50% of your gross income on housing costs. We're not really interested in people over a certain area median income that pay over that. If you're already wealthy and spending that much on housing, that's not the people we work with. We work with people who are generally below 140% of that area median income. So we're going to do demand and then supply. So Tampa, this is just an example. Tampa, St. Pete, Clearwater, MSA, that for 2020, a 4-person household median income is $69,200. And so that breaks down into these categories that we use in housing. Extremely low income means it's below 30% of that AMI, below 50% is low income, below 80% is moderate income, and then workforce is generally between 120 to 140% area median income. So this is the income for a 4-person household according to this 2020 $69,200. So what we want to know is what can you do with that income? So to be 30% of that on housing, you can afford, say if you're very low income, extremely low income, you can afford an apartment at $527 a month. In this Tampa St. Pete area, the fair market rent happens to be $548. They could probably afford that if they're there. The maximum this household could afford for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, if they wanted to buy, would be a mortgage of $332 a month. So you can see that some people are just out of the market, okay? But when you get down to, say, your moderate income folks, they can spend $1,406 on rent, and $1,463 is the fair market rent, and the maximum they could pay for a mortgage is $1,187. So that translates to what the market would bear in terms of houses that cost that amount. So but let's look at the supply, okay? And this is a calculation by how many homes are in that range per 100 people by income level. So the blue is Tampa, the cinnamon is Sarasota, Bradenton, MSA, and the silver is the citrus. So this very low, extremely low, there's only a little over 25 homes per 100 people who need that. All this white space means gap, okay? So when we go on up with the income levels, you can see that it's still huge shortages. The 80% is getting a little bit better. Citrus is showing that it has enough housing for people in that income level. And you can see that obviously people with more higher income there are more homes available for them. So that's what that means. One of the indicators of community resiliency is the availability of housing. So we just start there. That's why I'm starting there. Is there enough housing for everyone? Because all of the housing resilience activities that we do, we consider to be resilience oriented. If we're building or getting someone into a shelter or helping someone buy a home, that's increasing the community's resiliency. Another way to look at it real quick here, I just want to give you these images. This is the percent of your population that has a cost burden. Okay, so you can see that Pinellas and Hillsborough have almost 35% of their population is suffering with a cost burden. They're paying too much for housing. That's where those numbers lie. So you can kind of get an image of how much of your population does not have affordable housing. Just some housing issues statewide. There was an increase in Florida is always growing. So there's been an increase between 2000 and 2017 of 674,000 new rental units. And that units greater than 1,000 increased by 718,000, and that units coming out new that are below $1,000 decreased by 43,000. What that means is we are losing affordability, and you can see that in these charts with these blocks. 2,000 is the block on the left, and the below 1,000 rent is shown in the gray. And so you can see that it's going down while the rest of housing is going up. So it's not getting better. The National Low Income Housing Coalition shows a deficit of 400,000 units below 80% AMI and 576,000 at or below 50% AMI. That would relate to those charts we were looking at before. Then we need to talk about the housing losses due to damage from disasters. But from 2016 to 2000, there's been about 700,000 homes, probably more. I'm using very conservative estimates that were damaged or destroyed with the hurricanes we've had since then. Another factor is that there's 27,000 persons that are experiencing homelessness right now in Florida, to give you an idea of that. Okay, so another resiliency indicator is how old the homes are, because older homes, they may or may not do well in the hurricanes, but this just shows you that we've got a tremendous number of homes built between 1970 to 79 and then to 89. These early 70 homes weren't built with the best materials. Those are the ones that we see a lot of damage in. Just to give you a picture, this is in your own region here. The total number of homes is 1.7 million, just to give you that. Then the other resiliency factor is our mobile homes and our manufactured home communities. We have we have 197,000 mobile homes in the Tampa Bay region. This shows you the breakout by the county. Older mobile homes are subject to greater damage from different kinds of disasters. So I mentioned the impact of hurricanes from 2016 through 2020. Actually, 2020, I had no numbers in there. We don't have the estimates back from Sally, but people always ask us, what lessons have you learned from all these hurricanes? And I went back and looked at a lessons learned document from 2004, and it's the same darn lessons. We're still learning the same lessons. So we keep seeing that the low income and vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted. They can't evacuate as well. And if their homes are substandard or have deferred maintenance, they're gonna have more damage. We're seeing much more prolonged duration of people in shelters and temporary housing. They can't go back home because their homes are not habitable. Sometimes the displacement is permanent. After Hurricane Michael, 20,000 people evacuated, but 25,000 didn't come back because there was no place to live. So displacement is a serious impact. There's damage assessment irregularities, I'm saying, and that is that sometimes it takes months to find out how many homes were damaged in a disaster because you've got your locals doing the count and FEMA and HUD comes in. So we don't really know. It's not, I'm never comfortable with the number. It takes a prolonged time to repair and rebuild. Housing is infrastructure. After a disaster, they put back the communications, the roads are opened, the water sewers working again, but the housing sits there and basically rots for 2 to 4 years. So that period of time has to be shortened. If you're out of your home and homes are damaged, your economy can't get back to work. The kids can't go back to school. So everything's disrupted. I call this lack of funding sources complicated by administrations. And we see that there's a need for a statewide reform of the disaster recovery framework. We have state agencies that basically, by the time they get the federal money to rebuild homes, it takes years and years to get that money on the street. That needs to be reworked. Housing infrastructure is reduced in quality and safety. That was my mobile home and age point there. And we're having an increased awareness of the need for resilience, especially impacts to mobile homes. So those are the bad things. The good news here, these are the Florida Housing Coalition 7 mitigation principles. If you can put all of these 7 things into your programs robustly, and these are really worked on and included in the whole REACH program. But if you have these components, you're going to be in good shape. And that is that you have home hardening programs, you're elevating homes, you're rebuilding homes, you're buying out homes that have repetitive damage, but you're relocating those residents, those low-income residents. You're not just buying them out and saying, see you later. You want them to stay in the community. Mobile home replacements, anything pre-1994 should be replaced with a new manufactured home, but there's also tie downs and other enhancements that could be done to protect mobile homes. The fourth isn't a thing. It's basically a priority for low and moderate income and vulnerable populations. We don't, at the Florida Housing Coalition, everything is focused on LMI populations and housing for that group of income related people. The fifth is incentives and regulations working together. You want to reward and give regulatory assistance and funding to these techniques. You want to regulate away from dangerous areas. The sixth one's home insurance, wind and flood. That has gone up a lot since we've been having these huge disasters. Florida can't take more than 2 $50 billion storms in 1 year. Citizens will be insolvent if that happens in 1 year. We keep getting away with it. But there's a lot of incentives for homeowners to improve their home, and then they can get these benefits with the premiums. The last one is community engagement and competence. And this is basically the ability of your community to support a staff that has the capacity to rebuild and do these programs. A community that has things like community land trusts, you're using your surplus land, you're using green and best other resilient building types. And things like you have a good standing, it's not in my backyard. So that's all about the community. I'm going to end with this little design here. Y'all were talking about flooding and heat and so on. We showed these 4 short films at our conference this year. It's 1 hour. You can go there and to these links and download them. They are moving, they are stirring. They are put the picture on what these disasters do to people, and it's about the equitable recovery for people. So those are some links there. There's a password and so on. So I'm going to turn this over to Andrea, and thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you, Gladys. And would you just mind kind of flipping through the slides as I go, just to kind of, I'll try to go quickly. So thank you all. I'm really excited to be here today presenting, and I've really found the speakers so far to be very fascinating. And so this is a really exciting project. So I'm Andrea Galinsky with the UF Schimberg Center for Housing Studies, and I will give a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the data behind where affordable housing is at risk, specifically from coastal flooding. So as background today, I'm going to focus more on assisted housing specifically. And just to recap what that is, this is publicly owned housing. It could be housing that is privately owned but publicly subsidized. It may be a part of a number of federal or state programs with things like HUD, the Rural Development Program, tax credits, et cetera. So it's all of the developments that are subsidized in some way. So next slide. So what we're really interested in asking is, where is assisted housing exposed to coastal flooding? And when we try to answer that question, we might first look at FEMA's 100-year floodplain. This is a commonly cited reference, but what you can see on the left map are all of the assisted housing developments and properties that are within FEMA's special flood hazard area, or the 100-year floodplain. And then on the right, you see those same assisted properties, which are now within an area that's exposed to kind of a broader suite of flood hazards. So there's a lot more to the conversation, and a more complex understanding of the many factors leading to coastal flood risk. Next slide. So at the Schimberg Center, we wanted to quantify both current and future flood hazards in a statewide application. And we focused on these 5 indicators. So the 100 and 500-year floodplain, high tide flooding, storm surge from both higher frequency events, categories 1 through 3, and lower frequency events 4 and 5. Sea level rise at 2030, 2050 using the NOAA intermediate high assumptions, as well as post-Irma flooded lands. Okay, just another click. And so what we did to develop this application is we scored each assisted housing facility based on the number of indicators it was exposed to. This is a very simple additive presence or absence in a certain geographic area. It doesn't necessarily include any actual structural characteristics of the facilities, but you can get a sense that they're ranked low, medium, and high. And then next slide. So I'll quickly walk you through. This is the facility, the assisted housing that is exposed to 1 to 3 flood hazards. The next slide. These are assisted housing units exposed to 4 to 6 indicators. And these are housing units exposed to 6 to 8 indicators. Next slide. And so we also, in addition to knowing, where might be more vulnerable to flood risk, we also want to know, conversely, where are the areas that are less exposed to coastal hazards, and where might, promoting kind of future development be most appropriate. Next slide. So here you can see just all of those combined together to start to paint a bit more nuanced picture of where assisted housing may be vulnerable to both current and future risks, and where it also may be less vulnerable. Next slide. And so just another way to slice that information, here you can see kind of summarized at the county level which of those individual flood hazard factors are accounting for a greater proportion of the assisted housing units being included in some measure of flood risk. So for example, what you see are mostly kind of the purple in the pie charts, the purple and the blue. So that indicates that storm surge and being in a floodplain are kind of the two risk factors. And then you can see a little bit over time, the sea level rise at 2030 and 2050 start to become more important. Okay, next slide. And then we, in addition to just thinking about housing as an asset or a structure, we really also want to look at it as the people, the communities and the households in these areas. So what we have, and I know this is a little bit hard to see, but just very quickly, this is a map that combines two variables being the flood exposure from low, medium, and high, as well as a social vulnerability index. So what you can see is kind of the red areas are both at a high flood exposure as well as a high social vulnerability index. And you can kind of go down the list, seeing the various combinations of a high flood risk and a medium SOVI on and down to the having a lower exposure and a lower SOVI. Next slide. And so kind of digging into the details a little bit further, we also want to know what public funding programs include these properties or units that might be exposed to these coastal flood hazards. And I think like the big takeaway from this slide is kind of the top highlighted line that overall, looking at the kind of sum total of all of the various programs, over 50% of the region's approximately 25,000 assisted housing units are exposed to these coastal flood hazards. So that is not an insignificant scope of units. And you can look at this chart if anyone wants to kind of go a little bit into the greater details. You can get a sense both of kind of the percent of each program's units at risk. So for example, HUD and FHFC, that's around 60%, a little bit less. LFHA is 74%. And then you can also get a sense of overall how many units are included within that program. So the FHFC being the largest number of units. Next slide. Then additionally, thinking more about kind of a people centric approach, who is in these assisted housing units. So looking at, again, by program, you can see that in these units are folks, many may have children. For example, in the FHC portfolio, almost half of the households have children. And then interestingly, in the HUD subsidized multifamily, over 50% of those people are elders, 62 years and older. And they also have a very low average income. And this kind of reaches back to Doug's earlier presentation and Alice data that really looking at this kind of other demographic factors shows these kind of compounding risks from both a social vulnerability side as well as a flood risk side. Okay. Next slide, please. And so in sum, this information is really intended for us to be able to identify both the area's vulnerabilities as well as our resilience opportunities. And so we can start to tease apart things like where is the assisted housing located versus something I didn't really touch upon today, which is considered naturally occurring affordable housing, which is not publicly subsidized, but is affordable due to its circumstances, such as its age or its condition. We want to combine that with, better understanding who actually is living in these houses and kind of what funding programs are associated with them as well. And lastly, I didn't really hit on this too much today, but we can also start to really look at the housing characteristics themselves. So what type of structure is it? How old is it? Et cetera, et cetera. So next slide. So all of this information has, well, not all of us, a portion of that information has been consolidated in the Schimberg Center Housing and Coastal Flood Hazard web application at the statewide scale. And you can kind of view this app online. You can query the data if you're interested in kind of teasing out certain questions. You can conduct queries. You can download it to do more detailed analysis. And we are going to be modifying this app, which was previously funded through another JP Morgan Chase grant in 2018, 2020, kind of build on that and create a tool that is more tailored to and specific to the Tampa Bay area's various standards. So we want to look at regionally standardized flood hazards. Currently, the tool does not have the so-called NOAA properties. We'd like to incorporate kind of this wider range of understanding affordable housing that may be at risk. So I think I tried to go through that as quickly as possible.